Good morning and good afternoon to everyone who has joined us here today. It's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Heinrich Böll Foundation to this webinar on emerging trends in Indian foreign policy, perspectives for the West, which is the first edition of a series of webinars which we dubbed the Indian Foreign Policy Series, People, Power and Perspectives. My name is Jochen Lukschat and I'm the director of the New Delhi office of the Foundation. To those of you who are not very familiar with us as an organization, we are a political foundation affiliated to the Green Party in Germany. We act as a think tank and dialogue platform for green visions and ideas and have an international network of more than 35 offices working with many project partners in more than 60 countries. Undoubtedly, India is positioning itself as a significant global power, influencing events not only in the Indo-Pacific region, but also on a broader international scale. The country's successful hosting of the G20 summit in 2023, its active participation in fora like the Quad, and its substantial influence within global governance institutions underscore its growing prominence amidst rapidly changing global geopolitical landscape. India has increasingly also become a crucial partner for Western nations, including Germany and the European Union, based on a perceived convergence of interest. The increased attention India is therefore receiving in Germany and elsewhere in the West is, however, not always matched by a comprehensive understanding of what drives Indian foreign policy making. It's in a nutshell for this reason that we decided to collaborate with the Council for Strategic and Defense Research based here in Delhi as a knowledge partner to create a series of online webinars aimed at unpacking, analyzing, and interpreting the intricacies of Indian foreign policy, targeting audiences in Germany and Europe, but also India and elsewhere. With this first event, we're opening up the field by looking at the broader strokes of current Indian foreign policy making, while subsequent sessions will be more focused on specific aspects, themes, and issues. But more details on that will be announced at the end of the session here today. I also would like to take the opportunity to thank CSDR for the fruitful partnership, and of course the moderator and the three speakers we have with us here today for making their time and insights available to us. Also would like to thank my team for their efforts in putting this together, as well as the colleagues in the Berlin, Brussels, and Vienna offices for their collaboration and advertising this event in their respective networks. With this, I will already hand over to Devika from CSDR, and I very much look forward to today's inputs and discussions. Thank you. Over to you, Devika.
Thank you, Oken. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, depending on where you're joining from. My name is Devika. I'm a program associate at CSDR, and I would like to welcome all of you on behalf of CSDR, and thank you for joining us on this occasion. So a brief introduction. CSDR is a new age think tank committed to producing meaningful change, combining global and regional expertise to deliver tailored interventions rooted in rigorous research and experiential knowledge. Our expertise covers foreign policy, geopolitical risk, connectivity and geoeconomics, conflict resolution, peace building, climate change, and tech policy. And we specialize in the Indian subcontinent, Eurasia, and the Indo-Pacific. We are delighted to be hosting this webinar, Emerging Trends in Indian Foreign Policy Perspectives for the West, with HBS, and this is but the first under our collaboration with HBS, and we look forward to hosting more such discussions. So to kick things off, I would like to very briefly introduce our speakers. We have our moderator, Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who is a former diplomat and has served as India's first ambassador and permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and as Ambassador of Afghanistan, Nepal, and France. He's presently a distinguished fellow at CSDR. Thank you so much for joining, Ambassador Sood. We have Professor C. Raja Mohan, who is a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies at NUS, and was previously the director of ISAS, and he's also currently an advisor at CSDR. Thank you for joining, Professor Mohan. We have Ms. Ranja Sengupta, who is a senior researcher and coordinator of the trade program of the Third World Network, and she works extensively on trade and investment policies, including on the WTO and bilateral and regional trade and investment agreements. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us today. And we have Mr. Dinakar Peri, who's a defense correspondent for The Hindu, which is a leading national daily, and who's also a non-resident fellow at CSDR. So before I cede this room to Ambassador Sood, just some brief housekeeping notes. I request our panelists to keep their comments to 5 to 7 minutes and post the opening comments of the panelists and the moderated discussion. We will open the floor for questions and comments from our attendees. So please use the Q&A box to raise your questions for the moderator's consideration, and they will come to it. That's all from me. I now hand over the proceedings to Ambassador Sood, sir. Over to you.
Thank you, Devika. Let me also add my warm words of welcome to all the participants, and also my thanks to the HBS for coming together on this very timely webinar in terms of looking at emerging trends in Indian foreign policy and how does the West, and here I will focus more on West Europe, as it were, the European West, as it were, rather than the US, because otherwise the US would take up all our time. So I think this is an opportune time. We are just completing our elections, and there will be a new government in Delhi. And this new government will have to deal with a host of foreign policy challenges which India will face. Now, since we have about 5-7 minutes, and I just thought that what I will do is I will give a broad overview of the kind of challenges that I see that any new government in Delhi will be facing. And then our panelists, we have the first speaker is Dinakar, who has been writing on defense issues for a long time. Mohan, who's been writing on foreign policy issues for even a longer time. And we have Ranja Sengupta, who brings in her expertise on trade and economic related issues. So then they could each take up their area and elaborate a little more on the specifics of the challenges in terms of the Indian foreign policy and convergences with the West. So if that is all right, then I'll just kick off in the remaining 3-4 minutes. I essentially wanted to make 3 points. First, there is a degree of continuity in terms of the basic objectives of Indian foreign policy. And the basic objectives of Indian foreign policy have always remained that we need to have a conducive external environment within which we can move forward for economic development, where the people of India can achieve what their economic objectives and socio-economic objectives are. So in that, the key change that has taken place is, and here again, it is first and foremost, is our neighborhood. Now, our neighborhood, traditionally, we used to deal with our neighbors through bilateral relationships, whether it was with Pakistan or Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka or Nepal or whatever. But then in the mid-1980s, we saw the emergence of a regional platform called SAARC. Now, we all know that SAARC has been somewhat in the cold storage for the last nearly almost a decade, I would say. And therefore, there have been alternative regional platforms that have come up. I personally think that our neighborhood will continue to pose a challenge because we will have to make use of some kind of regional platforms in order to have our neighboring states find common cause and share in India's prosperity. Now, because all our neighbors are much smaller than India, there is naturally a certain reluctance or a hesitation or caution when it comes to dealing with us bilaterally. So to that extent, if we can multilateralize some framework, it would be far more beneficial and it would be far more reassuring for our neighbors. We have tried to do this through BIMSTEC, we have tried to do this through BBIN, and let me also say that since all our neighbors have close relationship with European countries, I think perhaps if we could partner together with some of our European colleagues, I think it would help us in moving things forward in terms of our ability to take the neighborhood together with us. That's challenge number one. Challenge number two is, I think, the key shift, and this is where the unpredictable element comes in. We don't know what the elections in the US will throw up. And so in that sense, we don't know where the US, whether it will turn more inward or whether it will remain as engaged and so on. Because the differences in the two candidates, namely President Biden and former President Trump, it couldn't be more stark. Okay, so I was talking about the outcome of the US election. And what I was mentioning was the fact that though we have seen a certain continuation in terms of the rivalry with China taking greater shape, we don't know how this will. We are not very clear as to how this will continue in under the Biden administration, if President Biden were to be re-elected, or under Trump too, if President Trump gets a second term. I think that particular relationship will also determine whether we will be looking at a bipolarity re-emerging in the world as existed during the Cold War, or whether we will be moving towards a multipolar world. Now, obviously, both Europe and India would like to see the emergence of a multipolar world, because that would also give us greater agency. But that is an equation that is going to be determined in Washington, D.C. and in Beijing, whether they come to some kind of a modus vivendi or whether they sharpen their rivalry. The third aspect of foreign policy is going to be the economic aspect, which is the fourth industrial revolution, which I call, the biggest example of that today is AI. But I would make this larger as the age of digital networks, because I think that is what defines the fourth industrial revolution. Now, so far, this has been dominated by the private companies, private sector companies in the United States. But this is still an industrial revolution that has enormous implications, cutting across all sectors, cutting across defense sectors as well as industry, cutting across areas like life sciences and biotechnology, cutting across quantum, cutting across a whole host of other industries, and with applications in all the socio-economic sectors. Once again, here, I think there is considerable scope for India and Europe. So there is a growing convergence of interests that I perceive, where we should be able to work together. We have set up with the EU a Trade and Technology Council. It has gotten off to a somewhat slow start, but I do think that this is something that should be accelerated and more meat should be put on it in years to come. I think I will stop here, and maybe the first speaker will be Dinakar. Dinakar, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, HBS and CSDR, for having me here as a panelist, along with the stalwarts on the panel. So to quickly start off, I'll just restrict myself to 5 minutes. Yeah. So I'll make just a few broad pointers. I'm sure there'll be other tangents coming in from the other speakers we can take forward in the discussion. So as the concept note says, the last decade, there has been a defining shift, etc., etc. So I'll just look at from a security, strategic, military angle. So that definitely has been a greater strand or emphasis if you actually go back in the last 1 decade. Not just diplomacy, but military diplomacy. The strategic, the reorientation or the strategic widening of India's canvas across the region. And that, in a way, comes from the realities in its backyard. And the biggest of them, we know, is China. In a way, because India has then probably woke up a little late and said, okay, we are losing this thing in the backyard, using your support grip, China creeping into the backyard. So in that sense, if you actually go back to say, for example, 2017, Indian Navy, which in a way leads the maritime diplomacy, to give an example, began what Navy calls the mission-based deployments. What it means in just one line, essentially it wanted to have presence in all the critical choke points across the Indian Ocean region, so that you know who is coming in, who is going out. And we know the reality of it. And why it was done? It's so obvious, the rapid expansion of the PLA Navy. So you don't want to be surprised. They're international waters, but you want to get surprised, and you wanted to know what's happening. So that kind of really gave a new philosophy of the way the Navy operated, the cycles. And then 2016, for example, India signed the first logistics agreement with the US. And from 2016 to 2020, India signed the BECA, the fourth agreement. So just 5 years, when the negotiation for the first one to be signed took over a decade. The others, many of you here would have followed that very closely. Over a decade. And then in 5 years, we signed all the 4 agreements. Now, the level of cooperation of the US, something probably no one would have imagined in the last 15 years, say 10 years back even. No one would have thought we could have done that. So these are necessities, India hedging, balancing. And the similar thing. 2016, that was India's first agreement, logistics agreement. But then branching out, India did a similar thing with all the countries in the region, with ASEAN countries, with European countries. Across anyone who is an Indian Ocean power, resident power, has a presence. India did a lot of information sharing agreements, maritime domain agreements, MDAs, and logistics agreements. So why was that? Just to increase your operational turnaround, your support and wherewithal on the high seas. That's because India does not have overseas bases, etc., etc. So these are essentially widening and broad-basing of partnerships, which is not done, say, 20 years back again. So that's in a way the changing dynamics of India's strategic, reorientation, if you want to call it. Again, the focus areas would be Middle East, ASEAN, Europe. But again, because if it's of interest, Europe, what we see is an individual approach. It's not an EU approach. A lot of EU countries talk about deepening cooperation with India, but on a bilateral basis. The EU as a collective doing something, so far it's still hasn't crystallized beyond a few dialogues or one-on discussion here and there. It's not really taken any concrete shape, because each country in Europe has a huge trade, security, economic interest with India. You name it: France, Germany, Italy, and you can go on naming them. But each of them has a certain engagement with India, and that's actually only deepening. Each single one of them does so many things now, but not collectively as EU. And just again, literally 1.5 minutes. The defense cooperation, one question I keep getting quite often, especially in the last 3 years since the war in Ukraine, is India moving away from Russia, or is it diversifying? So it's not a yes or no question. India is diversifying, yes, but India is not diversifying because the West wants India to diversify, because India has no more options. So in 2000 or early 90s, India did not have options. There were not too many people who were willing to sell military hardware, high-end military hardware to India. There were very few. It was only initially Soviet Union, then Russia. All the fighter planes, ships which India bought in the 80s, 90s. Then late 90s, Israel, France opened up. They emerged as reliable partners. In fact, 25 years back, the Kargil, we are marking 25 years of it now. That actually brought in 2 new friends for India, France and Israel. They then became close partners. Then early 2000s, US became, US opened up, the relationship opened up. So that again opened up the entire Western arsenal for India. So India had more options to choose from, better options to choose from, better bang for the buck, more not just rugged, but also quality, high-end technology, which initially only was Russia. So the diversification should be seen in that larger progression, but not just as India moving away, trying to dump Russia in any manner. No, Indian dependency on Russia will remain. That's something which India will maintain. So that multi-pronged axis, what we see as again, which has only sharpened in the last 1 decade, especially the last 3 years. Ukraine, then Israel, and the whole recent crisis, I think will only continue in the times to come. And one final point, there are expectations from India, logically, because it's a huge market. It offers an alternate option from China, but has India lived up to it? That's, I think, is an open question, open to debate. We can, my authority is probably India hasn't, because FTAs, for example, RCEP or so many others, they have been stuck for so long, either with EU or the RCEP. Countries wanted India to stand up and say, okay, given alternate option as a market, a supply chain, as a destination. Probably India did not probably live up to that. Something we can debate on. Thank you. Let's stop.
Thank you, Dinakar. May I now turn to Dr. Raja Mohan? Raj?
Yeah, thanks, Ambassador Sood. Wonderful to be here in this panel. I think Rakesh and Dinakar have already covered a lot of ground. So let me step back a little bit and look at some of the major structural changes that are taking place in India's foreign policy. I will focus on one and the implications of it. The biggest change in India's foreign policy, which is likely to be enduring for the near term, is the... Sorry, let me start my video. Can you see me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, sir, we can.
Okay. Sorry for that. So the biggest change in India's foreign policy over the last few years has been India's expanding cooperation with the West. For post-colonial India had its whole approach to the world involved keeping a significant political distance from the West. I'm not going into the reasons of it, but that was the fact that India kept a reasonable distance from the West on the economic, political, and a range of other domains. What we're seeing now is the amelioration of those problems, and India that is drawing closer than ever before to the United States and Europe and their allies in Asia. I believe this change is structural and is being driven by changing nature of the Indian economy, the changing nature of the security threats that India confronts, and a deeper social connect between the Indian and the Western societies that has emerged. These changes, I would say, are producing a worldview that is different. I might be a bit of a minority here. Essentially, a worldview that was defined by terms like non-alignment and strategic autonomy are less significant today in understanding where India is headed and what its challenges are looking ahead. So looking at the main tasks of Indian foreign policy today, I would say, to use the same phrase, strategic autonomy, the word was often used in relation to the West, that India must not depend too much on the West. In the process, I think we put ourselves in a situation where we are too dependent on China for economic growth in terms of manufactured goods, and too dependent on Russia for our security. So if we want to use the old language, the principal challenge for India then is how does it secure strategic autonomy, if you will, from China and Russia, dependencies that have been built over the decades. Now, this in turn demands greater cooperation with the West, I believe, but that cooperation must be defined by mutually acceptable terms of engagement. And I think that's where much of the story of the last few years has been and will be for the coming years. Too often, the differences that are quite public on a range of issues between India and the West, get a lot of attention, but it's important to see them in the context of fundamental change in the nature of the relationship between India and the West. In the past, the differences between India and the West were presented as irreconcilable contradictions. Today, the problem, what we're doing is really how to manage them, whether it's the Russian question or a range of other issues. It is a management problem rather than a fundamental structural question that exists between India and the West. So there are at least 4 or 5 areas where I would think the differences will endure. And the question is, how do we manage those differences? So let me quickly run through them in the remainder of my time. One, the question of Indian democracy. The expectation in the West that India will be judged on the basis of the current norms of a mature democracies was always a flawed assumption. And I don't see how that is going to work because India is stitching together a large, diverse nation within a range of its political constraints. And I think how India works itself out as a gigantic continent, sorting these problems out, those who want to brand India in specific terms, give us rankings, indexes. I think that is a largely a futile exercise because India will take its own time, will its own ways in which it is going to deepen its democracy and build this nation on a broad set of principles. I think here, the part of the problem is, of course, the West, the Western Enlightenment, which began, say, 400 years ago, was also coupled with colonization. Now, this is a central link that exists. And today, I think we need to remember that, particularly our Western friends, that the same way that it was preached during the colonial era, this notion that the West can dictate terms or define India in its own terms, that's going to be problematic. But I think the question of democratization is existential for India and given its diversity. So that's a challenge India will sort itself through, and how the West deals with it is really a secondary problem. There, I would say a West that has dealt with China, made money on China, should not have too many problems dealing with India's warts on India's face, if you will, on India's democratic face. So it doesn't too much worry me that it's really a discourse at the top that does not affect the fundamentals. A second deeper challenge, I think, is the question of building capitalism in India. As a late entrant, India's interest of how it builds its capitalism through protection, through range of other measures, would always run into the problem with the advanced capitalist societies, which would want to organize the world under a certain set of rules. And I think here, where there's question of market opening of India, market access for India, rising the question of migration, a whole set of issues related to how does in India that is building its own capitalism in partnership with the West, how does it sort out the interdependence that is emerging? Because India can be a major contributor to the Western growth, but at the same time, how does it work itself? How do the two sides work the differences over a range of issues like protectionism, market access? That I think is again a management issue that will have to be sorted out. A third set of issues relating to climate change. The question is again here, in India that needs to provide energy for its masses, and the question of does it work together to save the collective future of humanity as well. So there is a fundamental tension here, how we manage this problem, that in India that per capita low consumption versus growing carbon emissions at the collective level, how do we square this with the need to construct a new regime? I believe the answers to this will not come from putting people locked up in a room, negotiators of governments, but I think in the changing nature of technology and how we restructure the relationship between energy and economy, that's where the answers are. Here again, therefore, technological cooperation between India and the West becomes very, very important. A fourth set of differences, I think, is really about the question of where does India stand on multilateralism in relation to issues of global South? Here again, I think there is a tension. India's ambition to become a great power and its legacy claims of representing the global South. So I think here I would say the former would increasingly be more important. And while the governments might talk about being voice of the global South and championing global South, the logic of India's advance of building itself up would always prevail over the rhetoric about global South. And some of it, I believe, is driven by competition with China. So therefore, here again, there will be convergences between India and the West in terms of how India and the West can work together in producing some of the necessary transformations in the global South. But then where the public argument is framed at this point does not tell us that side of the story. Finally, I would say the question then, the big question for the West is how does the West accommodate a rising India in the global hierarchy? India's relative position as an economy is growing. as the military power is growing and technological power is growing. But the question of how does it fit formally into a West-led hierarchy is the big question. There, I would say the Americans have demonstrated a little more realism than the European idealism, if you will. But the question whether it is done through formal means of UN Security Council or not, I believe India's rise and its growing convergences with the West would demand some form of an accommodation of India at the higher level in the structure of the international system. So I'll stop here and take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Rajamohan. May I now turn to Dr. Sengupta? You have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood. Firstly, I'm not a doctor. I don't have a PhD. Miss will do. And can I also request you to kind of give me a warning after 5 minutes so that, I'm able to wrap up in time.
Okay.
And I think mine is like purely on trade because my organization, Third World Network, we have been working on trade issues along with other global issues such as climate change, intellectual property rights, global finance, and so on. So I've been focusing a lot on trade policy at the WTO and also India's bilateral trade agreements. So I think mine actually connects very well to what Professor Mohan was saying, that about India's role in multilateralism versus it being a champion of the global south. And the World Trade Organization is, of course, the space where we've seen this really culminate over the last many years, in fact, almost since the beginning of the WTO. And India is seen as a champion of developing countries and of development. And we work very closely with many developing country missions in Geneva. And that position is still clear. And I think many of the other developing countries do look to India for leadership. And there in the WTO, you do see a lot of conflict between India's position and the developed country positions, definitely with the EU and also US and other developed countries. But I'll come back to WTO at the end. But meanwhile, we know that as the WTO reached an impasse around 2008, and even before that, we've been seeing a lot of bilateral trade agreements and now mega free trade agreements like the TPP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in our region, which was ASEAN plus 6 countries, including India and China. And then now the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Partnership, which is US-led, kind of supposed to be a trade agreement, but not so binding. So India started engaging in FTAs, but earlier it was much more cautious. It was negotiating and signing mainly with other developing countries, but it was signing bigger and bigger agreements, like not just goods and services, but investment, intellectual property rights, many other things were coming in. But we've seen that even the current government, which came into power in 2013, they were initially very cautious on FTAs. And in a way that, they had not really signed with many developed countries. I think other than Japan and say South Korea, to the extent that it's developed, they had signed agreements, but with others, they had been, in fact, negotiating with the EU and FTA for a long, long time, like since 2007 to 2013. And then it actually reached a pause and they never considered an FTA with the US. And also, the trade agreements are there. Then there are the host of other agreements called investment treaties, which basically kind of, in order to attract foreign direct investment, these agreements have been signed globally, like more than 3,000 agreements. And India has signed more than 82. And this basically provides a kind of a guarantee to the foreign investor that your rights will be protected. But we've seen it, reach really kind of, very scary proportions where foreign companies can, actually, if government changes a policy, say if they bring in environmental policy, they bring in labor policy, or, protecting land policies, they are being challenged by the companies because their rights are kind of sacrosanct. And they can directly sue governments in secret global cases. So India has been burnt by many such cases. It has lost many cases. So it has been very wary about investment treaties. But now let me just move to what's happening now. I think since the last few years, we do see, and which is, I mean, I think goes with what, the earlier speakers spoke about, is that there's been a clear shift also in India's trade policy, not only in, its foreign policy or defense policy, but that we see that even in India's FTA policy, now India is very clearly and very, very keenly trying to sign and negotiate agreements with developed countries, and very fast. Like now we are seeing many agreements coming, one after the other. So with the UK, it has already signed one with the EFTA countries, and it's negotiating its close to deals with UK. I believe with also the EU one is moving fast. With Canada one is on hold mainly for political reasons, but also it signed a small agreement with Australia. It's negotiating with New Zealand and so on. And this shift, and I agree with the previous speakers, and these have become the earlier, what was trade policy, mainly economically driven, is now kind of being driven by geopolitical strategy. In fact, FTAs were always driven a bit, I think, by its geopolitical strategy. And now because of China, I agree with all of you that, it's also an anti-China initiative. And also because China's perceived, aggressive forays in trade and related fields. And in fact, this has also impacted India-China relationship within the WTO. But so I think as a result of that, India has been very keenly pursuing its trade relationships with major powers. And India also hopes that, potentially displace Western trade from China, given this increasing, worry of Western nations about China, that India hopes to secure some of that trade, I think. And EU, US also, of course, looking for new trade partners, big developing country markets, which is kind of separating from China and Russia. So I think that's why we see this. And as I said, so India is now really getting deep into it. But I think just to look at the content of these agreements, geopolitics is fine, but yes, 2 minutes left, right? Yes. Okay, very good. Thank you very much. So I think I wanted to end with the content, because finally it's about the content, and we've been tracking the content very closely. So one is with this agreement with the EU, and also this, Indo-Pacific Economic Partnership, which is US-led, as I said, and US is really designing all these chapters. So for India, while India wants access for its, IT services, for its workers under Mode 4 of services, and then it has garments, leather, pharmaceuticals, some automobile parts and stuff. But the problem is, I think India is very concerned and should be concerned about policy space for development. And it has many sensitive areas like agriculture and dairy, which are of great interest to all the developed countries. They really want access. And that these are very sensitive sectors for India. Intellectual property rights, because we have a generic industry, medicine industry, right? Pharmaceutical industry, which developed because India had flexible IPR regime. But in all these agreements, the developed countries are pushing India to go beyond the TRIPS agreement of the WTO, which will push out our generic industry, which will raise medicine prices. This is a very sensitive issue. And e-commerce, I agree with Ambassador Sood that this is the new area, the new oil. Data is the new oil, right? Based on which the fourth industrial revolution is supposed to happen. But data is also central. And in the trade agreements, we do see a push that, e-commerce, in the name of e-commerce, digital should be liberalized. And I think India and many other developing countries are worrying about their own policy space. They want to design policy for digital industrialization, for data protection and so on. And also issues like sustainability, natural resource, labor, gender are coming in, and how far India is ready to deal with these issues in trade agreements. I mean, how do they fit? These are all, I think, concerns for India. And I do see a lot of scope for cooperation between Western countries and India. But I would say that maybe a cooperation-based model would work very well, rather than, because these are legally binding commitments in trade agreements. And India may be much more kind of anxious about taking on these legally binding commitments. And at the WTO, I think it will be great if we could see more cooperation between Western countries and countries like India, but which would mean that from Western countries, we do need sensitivity about India's, India and other developing countries' development priorities. I mean, they have to be given the policy space. They have to be given the support to develop their way, that they should design their development paths. So I think if that could happen, it could based on, like mutual trust and cooperation, it could actually work very well. But I must say that we who are monitoring the trade agreements, we are quite concerned about some of the content coming out of these agreements. I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I think we have had 3 excellent presentations, and I have a couple of questions on each one. So perhaps I can start off with Dinakar. Dinakar, you talked of defense relationship, and you talked of the India-China, the downturn in India-China relations. Now, how far do you think Europe will have agency, or European countries will have agency in pursuing closer defense cooperation with us? And how far do you think that it will be still a bilateral issue with European role, as it were, in will be a mix of something that is decided in Brussels, particularly on the economic side, trade side, and so on, and even on the technology side, and partly, I guess, in individual European capitals. How does that come together, and where does it give us scope? How do we balance our interests here?
Sir, to that, purely from a European Europe catering to Indian requirements in terms of defense, I think it will remain at least in a pure defense sense, a bilateral issue. But then how does the EU come in? When you said trade and the larger economic framework kind of supplementing or supporting that actually comes in fact, that's where EU can actually make use of India, because India is a big base for raw materials. I mean, look at the last 3 years. Now European industry is in a crunch in terms of supply chains support. Say, for example, the ammunition reserves are running low. They're really running low on ammunition. Everyone is really racing to make up their deficiencies. One, they have to supply to Ukraine. 2, they have to make up their own stocks. There are 2 factors here. And your production, it's not easy to ramp up productions and go to that in overnight. It just does not happen. It takes a lot of time, and it creates huge disturbances in the supply chains across the world. I mean, many of our companies are now facing problems because their suppliers are actually now supplying to Europe at double the cost. So they are not getting stuff here. So the ripple effect. So India is actually a place which actually can meet European demand. India across, from raw materials to actual ordnance. I mean, we are also trying to increase our, say, defense exports. That's a huge complementarity which can be leveraged by both sides. So that's something which EU probably as a grouping, not just individual country, one country kind of trying to scuttle the other one. That's where probably that can happen. But from Indian point of view, to the initial part of the question, I think it will be European countries will play an important role, because they can actually give a balance between Russia on one side and the US on the other side. Because India does not want to put too much into the US basket. India is doing a lot with the US, but India also wants a balance again. Does not want to. I mean, if you actually look at just look at the recent examples, whatever US has done with the US, there has been a similar balance with France, for example. Fighter jets, engines, everything, helicopters, you name it. So India wants to diversify its options. So Europe actually presents a natural option. Many European countries don't have a backup into it. There is no political baggage, historical baggage, and it's a pure commercial or a strategic congruity which comes in. I think that answers the question.
Thank you. Dr. Raja Mohan, you talked about the differences, potential differences, shall we say, and you identified some of them in terms of differences over democracy or differences over multilateralism. Now, how far do you think after all, if you look at Europe as a whole, and I don't know whether you can take it either addressing it with EU as a whole or with individual countries, because within Europe also you see considerable differences. I mean, right now the biggest concern is the growth of the right wing, particularly in the forthcoming European Parliament elections. We also see emergence of leaders like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who prides himself on leading an illiberal democracy. So how far do you think, is this something that is more in terms of media or academia or things like that? Or how far do you think does it get reflected in government to government relations?
No, on the democracy question, I mean, there is a general discourse in the West, in the think tanks, all these indices on, where India's freedom index, in some of these indices have listed India below Afghanistan. So I think there is a whole culture of rating India. I think the problem is, given Europe's own past, I think to take this kind of an attitude, at least even in the intellectual level, has no credibility. I mean, I just give you one example. Ambassador, you served in Afghanistan as ambassador there. Now, for 30 years, we saw the West come and support the jihad against a progressive Marxist regime. Okay, Marxists may or may not be progressive, but the regime that came to power in 1978 was seeking social reform, modernization, liberating women. And there, the West came armed jihadi groups, which overthrew this regime and brought a vengeance. And then, after $20 trillion, you've taken to bring the Taliban back. So I think there has to be some self-reflection within the West, that there's merely talking the big talk on democracy, and they don't record how it's actually worked out. I mean, I said I went back to enlightenment. So I think there has to be a modesty. And India is not being democratic to please the West, that it is within its own internal structure. That is, there's no way of organizing Indian diversity except in a democratic form. But how that works itself out in conditions of great constraints is the question. And there, I think, but that's something India, 1.4 billion people have to work themselves out. But I also added that the governments are pragmatic. Like Europe conducts a human rights dialogue with China. You have to tick off some boxes. But in the end, today, if you look at the Europeans, what are they saying? China market is very important. Some of them say they're even willing to defy the United States in order to preserve their strategic autonomy to engage with communist China. So I think this is part of, I'm not saying Europeans have any special hypocrisy. All of us have our own hypocrisies. But I think as a pragmatist, I would say the bark on democracy is worse than the bite. So in India that is pragmatic can actually engage with these issues. And as it improves itself, and I think there's a way of managing this. So that was my main point.
That's interesting, because somewhere I do think, and I don't know if you will agree with me on this, I think the Chinese have a much more pragmatic streak.
Exactly.
Like we would be very reluctant to engage in a human rights dialogue. We would look at it as an affront. We would be touchy about it or prickly about it. Whereas the Chinese are happy to go along as long as it opens up markets and things like that. So as long as they can get good deals, and as long as they can get investment from European companies, which is what is happening, they have gone along with this dialogue. Whereas we would tend to react somewhat more in a more prickly fashion. I mean, I don't know whether you would agree or not.
I agree with you. I hope your colleagues in the Foreign Office are learning from this. And rather than this prickly, who are you to tell me argument, to one of actually engaging with them. And I think ease of doing business and making it easier for the Europeans to invest in India will have a far greater effect than arguing that I'm sovereign, who are you to tell me, which has been the temptation of the Indian intellectuals, and to make it into an irreconcilable contradiction with the West. So I think that's a long tradition in India. Hopefully the governments are getting a little more pragmatic and learned how to deal with Europe from a sense of pragmatism, a common interest, and recognizing Europe has interests other than preaching democracy.
Thank you. May I turn to you, Ranja? And you talked of you made an interesting comment about the fact that in WTO, we are often seen as a voice of the, or as a leading voice of the global South, because the issues that we take up or the positions that we adopt are often positions which put us into opposition, shall we say, with the developed countries. So with that, how do you see the prospects of FTAs with developed countries? Because, as you said, we've signed a partial agreement with Australia. We are in the process of negotiating one with the EU, with the United States, and things like that, and with UK. So, which seems to be a shift. So, how do you reconcile the position in the WTO, or is it that the WTO now, because it is now an organization which seems to be somewhat waning, shall I say? Is it that is where it has become irrelevant?
What I would say is, for us also, it's perplexing that India's position in the WTO and in FTAs, it kind of it differs quite a bit, right? But I think finally it's trade and commerce which talks. So for India also, I mean, because they see that the WTO is the multilateral space, so whatever rules you agree to, applies to all 164 member countries and your trade with them. And therefore, they are more, and so there are a lot of principled positions. And I would actually support many of India's position in the WTO. I work closely on agriculture and fisheries subsidies agreement, and we work a lot on WTO reform and stuff like that. And I think this, the development dimension that WTO had promised to deliver, to help developing countries catch up on development. They were supposed to get certain preferential treatment, and we've seen a lot of challenge to those kind of issues. And whatever they promised, a lot of it is not realized in the WTO. So I can understand India's position in the WTO. But I think when it comes to FTAs, both the developed countries and India kind of, they have decided to kind of seek out this more different and bilateral path in mutual commercial interest, because that's where they see the lot of the future trade happening, right? And but I think even over there, as I was saying, that on a lot of these issues, which are very sensitive policy areas for India, India is, again, India negotiates very hard. It is much more cautious. So that's the challenge it's coming up with. But on FTAs, yes, India is definitely more strategic. It is being kind of driven by its geopolitical considerations. We see a direct reflection of that in the FTAs. And I also wish there would be, more synergy between India's WTO positioning and what it's trying to do through the FTAs. Yeah.
Why? I mean, what would you explain as the reasons behind this lack of synergy? I mean, is it that there are different people in different forums? I mean, how would you explain it? I mean, after all, to the outside world, it would be India's Commerce Ministry which is negotiating. So why should there be this lack of synergy? Or is it a historic legacy?
Yeah. I think it's because they see it as bilateral, that it does not have such a pervasive impact. And as you said, that the WTO's influence in the middle, since 2008 to even maybe 6-7 years back, I would say WTO's influence had waned. And therefore, India was putting all its energy into getting these bilateral deals. But, and they also feel, whatever they can concede in the FTAs, because it's bilateral, the WTO is a different thing. I have seen many Commerce Ministry officials and negotiators say, oh, this is an FTA. We can do it here, but we cannot give the same thing in the WTO because it's multilateral. But at the same time, there are issues that, are coming into the FTAs, like what you do to intellectual property rights. You cannot do it bilaterally. If you give concessions, they have given concessions to EFTA, and then if they give to the EU, it's multilateral automatically, because you basically change your IP laws within the country, right? And then digital economy, what you do bilaterally will definitely have multilateral repercussions. So I think sooner or later, India will have to integrate. They cannot be separate tracks. But I would also say that the WTO is not waning anymore. We have seen under the new Director General, etc., this resurgence in the WTO, because many issues because they were not moving in the WTO, they had gone the bilateral route, right? Mainly driven by the developed countries. What they could not get in the WTO, they were wanting to get through bilateral deals, which are quicker, simpler, easier to do, and so on. But now we see that there is this initiative that if these countries are agreeing to digital, liberalization, e-commerce liberalization in many FTAs, then let's multilateralize it at the WTO. So there is like many things are really now moving in the WTO. So I think if we think that, okay, WTO is not moving, only FTAs, it is not true anymore. WTO is also woken up. And so, I mean, both these policies and approaches will definitely have to be synergized, I would say.
Rakesh, can I just come in briefly on this?
Sure.
I think we have had Ambassador Sood, again, he served in Geneva, so he's quite used to this grand posturing, tradition of posturing in multilateral negotiation that India has had, whether it's disarmament, arms control, whether it is nuclear, WTO, sometimes, we seem to be championing an army, causes of the South. Well, the South itself is divided on a range on trade issues in particular. Often there's no one following India, but it has become a habit. It's domestic political posturing on a number of issues, whether it suits actually Indian interests or not. But I would say the tension in the last 30 years has been as the structure of its interests change. In India, that's economy that's opening up. It's going to be the third largest economy. The nature of its economic interests change. The question of changing the political positions in multilateral institutions. I think that's where the tension is. Normally, the multilateralists tend to be a home alone crowd. They have a lot of autonomy, strategically, if you will. But I'd say, like in the nuclear field, we've seen significant changes. So changes will come. I think it's a battle that has to be fought within, and where competing interests will demand competing approaches to what we need in the international system. And I think it's not in any democracy that's also true. Like in the US, the battle between different groups on trade policy. So I think that's quite natural. But I think, at least in India, that battle is not explicit. And I think we hope there'll be more of that in the coming years.
Yes, and I would add one more thing, Dr. Raja Mohan. I would say that, I think that our becoming the voice of the global South today, particularly on issues like climate change, particularly on issues of equity in development, on issues like data and so on, is somewhat different than, let us say, the trade unionist approach to which you were referring of during the Cold War. And I dare say that as somebody who can, as a country that can speak to both sides of the aisle, it may not be a bad role to be in. Because in some senses, with regard to digitalization, with regard to data, we are seen as a country which has achieved certain things, which, let us say, don't exist in terms of a digital public infrastructure, something that the Western countries don't really have. But the developing world, the global South, can use that. And so therefore, it may not be a bad thing, even for EU, even for the Europeans, to have India as a more credible interlocutor to work with the global South. I don't know if you have any.
No, I think it's a case by case. For example, like on the nuclear issue, we were great champions of disarmament. Today, we don't sign to the Nuclear Abolition Treaty. When we talk about climate change, the island states want to ban on coal right away. We're not on the same page as the island states. We're not on the same page, large number of groups in trade, So I think in some areas it might work, but I think some of the pragmatism I'm seeing is India today is willing to work with European countries bilaterally, collectively, as well as with the US. Let's work together in Africa. Instead of this posturing, what are the practical things we can do on the ground for the global South? I see some movement in the direction. I think that's a positive way of going forward, I believe.
Yes. Yeah, rather than the trade union approach. Yeah. I think on that we are agreed. Okay, I think we can now move to the Q&A. I don't know if everybody can take a look. I think, okay, if I will try and read out the questions, and any of you can take them on. I don't really, unless somebody has specified. Dinakar, this seems to be directed at you. I mean, said that EU has been largely an economic partnership, and EU also realizes after Russia-Ukraine war that defense, the role of collective defense, as it were, has enlarged within the EU framework. So is EU-India cooperation not practical, or does it still mean that bilateral agreements for this topic will remain the important thing for even today? Dinakar?
Someone wants to, yes, sir. Yeah, I think someone wants to answer the question. But anyway, just to very briefly, to kind of partly repeating what I said earlier, that's something for, see, partly the issue of the Russia-Ukraine war, that's something for EU to, you know, get to India and see India as a viable alternative for it to fall back on, because there are limitations. India is someone which has the capacity, which can offer that bandwidth. Now, there are not too many countries. There are concerns with China. There are concerns, you know, there are limitations. US is tied up with its own, you know, and there are not too many who can, you know, provide that alternate, both supply chains, raw materials, backup in terms of on so many parameters. So I think it's something that India and EU should sit and talk together and do it. Yes, it's possible, but what happens, we'll have to see.
Dr. Mohan, I guess this would fall within the kind of geopolitical framework that you have been talking about. The question is, how far can the recent Russia-China bonhomie bring India and Europe cooperation closer, especially in the Indo-Pacific? And related to it is that should the Quad Plus engagements incorporate major European powers? And if so, how should Indian foreign policy look at it?
No, on the China-Russia question, I mean, I think it's a very, very important question. I think there is a real possibility, a necessity, I would say, for India and Europe to work together to deal with the consequences of the new Eurasian alliance between China and Russia. But here's the problem. I mean, the Europeans ducked the China question, and the Indians ducked the Russia question for good reasons. I mean, that the Europeans depend on Chinese market, Indians depend on Russian supplies for weapons. So therefore, that dependency make them take positions. While Europeans are forthcoming on the Russia question, they're ducking the China question. I mean, similarly with us, with great ferocity, we talk about autonomy and why we need to keep a relationship with Russia. But my sense is, irrespective of our current dependencies, that this alignment between the two Eurasian continental powers demands that the maritime periphery of Eurasia, that is including Western Europe, India, Japan, Australia, that we need to build a countervailing coalition. That is, India's objectives in relation to balancing China will be undermined by China's alliance with the Russians. Similarly, Europe's effort to build a secure order in Europe are undermined by China's partnership with Russia. So here we are. Europe, that was criticizing China for not criticizing the intervention, today is almost pleading with China, please help us with Putin. So I think this is where that the answer to this is not pleading with Putin or asking Chinese to be nice, but I think we need to do more together. And I think this is where I would say there's a lot of opening here. Given the structural change in the geopolitics, India and Europe need to do more with each other in order to produce balance, because the US, given what's happening with Trump, and the logic question, why should the US taxpayer forever pay the security of Europeans and the Northeast Asians? That demands we do more ourselves, and in which India has the motivation and skill, Europe has the capacity. If we can put them together, we can produce a better geopolitical structure in Eurasia. On the Quad issue, Plus is not happening anytime soon. is quite clear at this point. It's going to be fabulous 4, and there's no Quad plus. But the things that we can do with each other, I mean, that is, for example, France is doing things with India, Britain is in AUKUS. So there are multiple ways in which we can collaborate with the European powers. The Japanese are doing quite a bit. 4 Asian countries, AP4, that is Japan, Korea, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand are part of the NATO discussions. So I would say India should shed its reluctance to engage with NATO on European security issues, with PESCO and a range of European issues. And similarly, Europe should reach out to India to do more collaboration. So I think, we in India tend to get stuck with the formalism of structures. The question is not how many members sit in the Quad. What is it that we do with Europe, with Britain, with France, with Germany, and EU as a collective? That is, I think, far more consequential than how many members are there today in the Quad.
Perhaps Nakul Sharma has posed a question which I would suggest perhaps Ranja could take on, which is, how can India manage the dual standards of the West on the issue of development and climate finance inflows? The context of this is the failure of the West to deliver on climate finance from global north to south. And now there is this new narrative of private sector investment, and instead of the allocation of finance under the polluter pay principle. Since this is also a subject which is very much there in the multilateral arena in terms of the COP conferences, how do you think this should be addressed, and where should India be in this conversation?
Yeah, in fact, I mean, I think there are also other questions related to climate.
Yes,
And
I know. There is another.
Right, this is the next one also.
Whether India be a climate pioneer or not. So you can please go ahead.
I mean, I mean, my organization works a lot on climate change issues, kind of from a developing country perspective, but also we are seeing increasingly the sustainability issue and climate issue coming into trade. It's a big issue in the FTAs and also in the World Trade Organization. So one is, I know from my work with not only India, but many other developing countries in the WTO space, is that one is that they keep saying that, when you are talking about, say, investment agreements, for example, the ISDS, that the ability of foreign companies to challenge, for example, climate policies, environmental policies, environment protection measures across developing countries has been a major challenge actually in meeting climate objectives. And at the same time, as Nakul very clearly, I mean, I would very much agree that we have not seen the money coming through in the climate negotiations. We haven't seen the money transfer, nor have we seen the technology transfer, right? The technology, the climate, the environment-friendly technologies are actually blocked off with intellectual property rights. We have to pay heavily for those technologies. We, of course, need to develop our own indigenous technology, but at the same time, flow of both finance and technology has been the problematic area under the climate discussions. And now we are seeing that in the trade, I mean, and it was inevitable that, sustainability issues will come under trade agreements. But I think what India and what we hear from many other developing countries is the worry that, for one, for example, EU is dictating to its unilateral measures, like the Deforestation Act, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which they're unilaterally imposing at the border, which is a problem for developing countries. It does not recognize the space they need for, and also we see through the trade discourse that, when developing countries are going to move to greener pathways, they should be able to do it through their own production and create jobs in the process. But we often see the Western countries are trying to give us all the environmentally, the products and services should come from the West, and they're cutting off our options to develop it within our countries. So I think those kind of challenges are there. The climate change negotiations have failed to meet some of these. But we also see sustainability being used in the trade negotiations as a way to set standards. So there are very complex kind of issues here. And I think we definitely need to sit down and really work these out with the developed countries. A lot of complex issues, unilateral measures and everything. We really need a dialogue and resolution.
Then I noticed that somebody has put a question here, which is interesting because, can Indian private sector receive support from Western funds so that it can provide as a technology provider to Africa? And they cite examples of a Reliance-backed consortium and so on in working in Ghana, and whether this would be a viable. So I suppose there would be certain sectors where we could have this kind of cooperation, and other sectors of climate that you've referred to where we find ourselves at a bit of a loggerheads. Would that be a fair assessment?
You're asking, can I say something on this?
Sure.
Look, I think Reliance is not in the charity business. That this is a commercial deal. And I think we should get over this notion that we are doing good to Africa by taking digital infrastructure. Huawei is already there in a big way. Airtel is already there. So I think the question is...
The questioner also says whether this will enable containment of China. I think given the fact that Huawei has a huge footprint already, massive. I don't think China can be contained in Africa by such initiatives, which are pretty nascent in their approach.
I think the challenge is to give commercially more viable, more practical at interest rates, unlike the kind of gorging thing that the Chinese do. Offer practically, there is a better deal that you can deliver in some areas. If you can do that, that is far more consequential than doing as if we are doing some favor to the developing world, global south. I think we should drop a lot of that pretense and focus on actually having capability to export and then working with the local companies to offer terms which are better than what China offers.
I would also like to come in on that. I think private investments do create technology diffusion, right? We keep hearing that, right? That technology transfer will happen. And that's why we need foreign investment from Western countries, and India will invest in, like poorer countries and so on. I mean, some of it is undeniable, some technology diffusion, etc. And because of investment, some job creation, growth, etc. will happen. But what we have seen, I was very closely following the SDG negotiations, but in there also, and it's kind of said that, private sectors and companies will solve all the problems of development. But they are profit making, right? Their objective, and it's clear that they will make profits. So when you are saying that they will solve world's water problems and their health problem, they are there to make a profit. So do not expect that you'll get it cheap. And the way we have seen that Western companies, Western investments in many developing countries have been kind of, like they have been, there is a lot of criticism that they've been using up our natural resources, our cheap labor and so on to basically make the value addition back in their countries. But a lot of Indian companies are doing the same in Africa. So I'm not against private companies investing, but I think I would also say government to government cooperation would be a more reliable way. And we should also keep and watch that, Indian companies do not do the same kind of takeover in these African countries like we have faced sometimes in the past.
Thank you. There is one question, whoever is brave enough to take it on, I leave it open to any of you three, which is about the feasibility, about India's stand on Taiwan and the situation in Hong Kong. And the question is, if CCP, if the Communist Party of China is increasingly hostile and may one day take military action to unite the island of Taiwan. Anybody wants to gaze into the crystal ball and make a prediction?
I think India will be the next. The day Taiwan falls, India should watch out for what happens in the Himalayas. So I think it is in the core interest defined by China. So I think there's been too long a temptation in Delhi to see Taiwan as some distant issue, and that it is not something that concerns us. To one where I think we got to see the fall of Taiwan would have dramatic consequences for the whole of Asian geopolitics, the structure of the Western Pacific, and its consequences for what happens on Himalayas. Therefore, I think while we can't be sending troops, I don't think we have the capacity to send troops to defend Taiwan against, that's a job US, Japan, and others will have to do. But I think on the diplomatic front, on the political front, I think India needs to stand up that force can't be used to change boundaries. And I think that's a principle I think India has always claimed to support, though it kind of mum on the Russian issues, but that's okay. But in this case, it directly affects India of what happens in Taiwan will directly affect India's security. And some of our former ambassadors, like, I don't know, some of you have seen Ambassador Vijay Gokhale's paper, that must take it as a major concern for us. So I think first place to start is in diplomacy, in foreign policy, to deal with this issue and raising questions, raising and generating support, Indian support for not just Taiwan, but Philippines and others who are at the receiving end of Chinese expansionism in Asia.
Yeah, but then just as you yourself pointed out, since we have a lot of European participants in this discussion, and the fact that we don't say much about the Ukraine thing and Russia's efforts to change boundaries by force, it kind of gets us into some sort of...
No, consistency is a virtue rarely seen in international affairs. So I don't think no country follows it in a consistent way. Just as the Europeans don't, they're concerned about Russian imperialism, but not Chinese expansionism. So I think we should, while these kind of double standards will be there, the key question is, can we work together on some of these issues so that we expand the areas of cooperation?
Yeah. Let me take another question. Perhaps maybe we can look at this one on... there is another question which is very future-oriented, which is a timeline for the establishment of a free movement or mobility agreement between India and the European Union. Anybody wants to take a shot at it? Once again, this is,
I think India is negotiating bilateral agreements of mobility and migration, but it also varies from country to country, I think.
Right. And India is, in fact, for India's FTAs, as I was mentioning, Mode 4, or the movement of professionals for work, is a very important part of these FTAs that India has signed. And India says that it's the big offensive interest for India, right, to get access for Indian workers abroad. But frankly, from whatever negotiations it has done with the EU or even in the regional comprehensive economic partnership, which was ASEAN plus 6 countries, including China, it did not make any headway. I mean, because I think given the global environment, to expect that, labor markets will open up for especially unskilled workers in India or semi-skilled workers, it is really kind of quite a hope. I don't think it's going to materialize. No country is frankly in a position to open up, like, unless, I mean, they may want specific skilled workers. For example, UK wants doctors and nurses and so on. But generally, and even the trade agreements are limited to professional, temporary movement of professional workers. And even in that limited scope, India hasn't had much success. So that's quite kind of, I think, not much hope. But I would later on maybe like to come back, Ambassador Sood, to the question on raw material. That's quite interesting. There's a question from Sina Rauch. I'm pronouncing it wrong. I'll come back to it. Maybe others would like to take up this question.
Rakesh, can I just come in on the migration issue just briefly? I mean,
Sure.
Look, I think for 50 years, Indian migration took place and was welcomed with open arms because the Western societies had the need for Indian talent. And that didn't come from formal agreements negotiated between the governments. The Western borders were open. And Indian talent was welcome, and much of the foreign talent was welcome, and Indians gained from it. But today, I think we got to recognize that there's a backlash against immigration in Europe and North America, and that you can't simply keep pushing your people. So therefore, I think the innovation in the migration and mobility agreements is this, that India would take back illegal migrants to UK. That was the agreement. While Europeans would facilitate more Indian talent and technical skills into European countries. In fact, Germany, many countries are looking for Indian talent. So this is going to be driven by corporate interests. But at the same time, the social backlash that is coming against it will have to be managed. So I think it's important for India to emphasize it does not support illegal immigration. It will take back illegal migrants from India while actually facilitating a talent movement to suit interests of both the countries. And meanwhile, the rise of the global capacity centers in India, which means actually a lot of work can be done within India. So there are alternative ways in which I think we can go forward.
Yeah. Dinakar, since you probably deal with this in media on a daily basis, what is the strategy? You know, we are talking here about the downturn, for example, between India and Canada, or it could be happen with other countries as well. So what is the strategy that the government should take on the dissents and critics of Indian diaspora around the world?
Well, we have seen how things have been playing out in the last other couple of years, or especially in the last few months. So it's been rather sharp. It's been rather sharp, and much to the displeasure of many countries. I mean, we keep hearing in closed conversations, we keep hearing that. I'm sure you have heard that as well. You know how it's playing out. I mean, it's actually in a way it does impact the way the media, the way the media operates as well. I mean, even we have seen too many cases where a media outlet who has been did a little has been slightly critical, has to had to face the music, and had faced restrictions or other things. So that's I guess this could become a touchy issue at some point, because the way again the West sees, or the way the West sees, or the way Europe sees it, is a different thing. In sense, the freedom and the freedom of speech, or this could be, I mean, probably something which will not come out in the public, but this actually could be a touchy issue in the back conversations between the countries. And we know this has happened. For example, on the same thing, what happened in Canada, and people who have been critical have been faced a lot of backlash. Journalists, I'm talking about the media. And this has been raised. I mean, this has been raised by those countries with our chaps. I mean, their Indian counterparts, wherever, or even in their discussions in India. I think is a potential friction point, which will.
Because I think now we also see some signs of it. We see some signs of something not similar, but in a sense, somewhat parallel in Australia as well. So I think we need to be
exactly. What is it? It's actually only spreading to other countries. So now we have Canada, US, Britain. In fact, I mean, where these pro-Palestinian, things keep coming up. Someone has written something. Someone had done a podcast on something. We have been, now we have about 4 or 5 countries, and it looks only like, growing in scope and magnitude in terms of,
I guess it's part of the price that we have to pay for large Indian diaspora the world over.
Exactly. Everything has a flip side. And that's exactly what, to the mobility point of it, is also the same thing. The concerns will only, these issues actually will definitely raise more concerns in those countries. I mean, Indian diaspora has always been seen as something which assimilates into the local population, unless, say, other communities which do not, which stand out in terms of asserting their own identity. But Indian generally are seen that way. But now these actually raise questions as to, potential. I mean, I've had people asking me, or telling me from European countries, saying, "Oh, this is actually, this is something we'll watch out in future." For the larger, I mean, skilled workers is one thing, but for the larger population. In terms of visas again.
Sorry. Ranja, you wanted to take on the question about raw materials. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think raw material has become a big issue. One is, of course, the traditional natural resources, minerals, but also, raw material for just industrial production. I mean, for example, wood that, for example, raw leather and wood that you kind of use to develop your industry, like furniture or leather production and so on. For example, India had imposed a 25% export tax on export of raw leather. And that's how it could ensure that there was supply of raw material within the country. And that's why our leather industry has become so developed and so competitive, actually, that we are one of the largest leather exporters. So every country, I mean, the developed countries, every country has used like their raw material for their own value addition. So I think in India and the global South developing countries are really now trying to do it. And we know, as you, I mean, I think Dinakar, right, you pointed out that EU is actually running out of raw material. They have something called the Raw Material Initiative, which was started in 2008. It's a specific policy. Now they have the Raw Material Act, which clearly says that they want to have access to raw material from developing countries, and they will use the trade agreements for that. And the investment agreements I was talking about, the investment agreements, as well as they do not want export taxes. These have been used to ensure the supply of raw material from developing countries for value addition in the developed countries, right? Now, I think as the question that there's a concern that's expressed, and we have also very much kind of expressed those concerns ourselves, that, you know, why should raw material go out of developing countries in an unfettered way? A lot of the time is the benefit is to developed countries. And for us, you know, there has been land grab and natural resource grab and water pollution through this kind of mineral extraction in developing countries. Lot of ISDS cases, lot of these investment treaty cases, mineral cases are like half the global investment treaty cases. And India had, in fact, in Hyderabad, there was a big case where one company, I mean, the local tribes, they actually sued because this company got a bauxite mining license, and the local population, they did not want their land grabbed. But when the government of Andhra Pradesh resisted, they actually faced a investment treaty case, and they lost $47.5 million is as payment. So, you know, so the whole issue of how we will manage our raw material, what is our right over our natural resources. And now we are talking about minerals and raw material like wood, that agricultural raw material. And it's also moving to data as a raw material, you know. How, I mean, do we then, you know, we will definitely have cooperation agreements, but how do we allow our raw material to be taken out, to be used? We want to be part of that value addition processes. How do we ensure, and how do we then have, you know, such cooperation agreements is going to be, I think, an important issue for us.
Thank you. I think, since we are running a little short on time, let me try and take a couple of questions, including one that has been addressed to me. I think that the question that has been addressed is, would India be willing to accept greater European engagement in its neighborhood? I think we are already making a beginning towards it. We are working together with Japan on a number of infrastructure-related projects in our neighborhood. And I'm quite sure we would not be averse to having either EU as a whole or perhaps individual European countries we could work together with in our neighborhood. We could at least make a beginning on that score. BRICS wasn't mentioned very much, but then we didn't have much of an audience in terms of BRICS. And in any case, I think with the expansion of BRICS that is now underway, we'll see the first expanded summit. I think it is quite clear that BRICS the expansion is in the global south. So it is becoming, or it will, if the Chinese and the Russians have their way, it will become a vehicle for the global south. And it will be interesting to see how it evolves in that sense. We already saw one candidate country for the BRICS. I think it was Argentina that has said after the change of government there that now they are not interested in becoming a member of BRICS. So it's going to be an interesting thing. Where should India position itself in the global AI race? I think India will have to have its own position. You see, the reason is that while the global AI race, in a sense, is dominated right now by the US companies almost across the board, whether it is in terms of production of hardware like NVIDIA's GPUs, or whether it is in terms of LLMs, which are being worked on, whether by Google and OpenAI and so on, or whether by the cloud service providers, things like that. EU has tried to present itself as a regulatory superpower taking advantage of the large number of countries that it represents in terms of the EU Act. Now, India has the advantage that it probably has adopted with its digital public infrastructure a different kind of a model, something that does not exist in the developed world. Obviously, it doesn't exist because the developed world didn't have need for it. It's like in India where we didn't have landline telephones, but we shifted or we leapfrogged the generation with the mobile revolution. And the mobile revolution forced us and permitted us to develop certain technologies in terms of the digital infrastructure, which were not necessary in the developed world. So mobile payments or mobile wallets was something which wasn't needed in the developed world because everybody had credit cards. Since in India, the credit card thing was much, much smaller, mobile wallets fulfilled the need. So I think that here we have a slightly different approach. Maybe we can work together. We will have our own rules and regulations. We would like to have data privacy. We would like to have data security. We would like to have the ownership of our own infrastructure. So we would like to have, which we are also, and these are models that we are prepared to share. So I don't know where we will position ourselves. It won't be directly with the US. It won't be directly with the EU. I think we will have to carve out our own space. Regarding the UN Summit of the Future and the G20 meeting in Brazil, my guess is I think a lot of this will depend upon which is the government that comes to what takes over in the first week of June in Delhi. Because at the G20, what we saw was a conscious effort in terms of trying to get an inclusive approach. The admission of the African Union was a key point. The concerns of the Global South was a key point. Because there is a general feeling with COVID-19 and with the contradictory approaches being taken by the West in the conflict on Gaza and the conflict in Ukraine, that there is a growing distance or a disenchantment. I mean, the hypocrisy, as it were, is becoming very visible insofar as the Global South is concerned, which also suffers from the consequences of these conflicts in no small fashion. And I think some of this is what has become much more apparent. COVID-19 also showed the phenomena of vaccine nationalism. And it also showed a failure of multilateralism. So some of these things will certainly be the focus. And depending on the priorities of the new government in Delhi, there could be other issues as well. One question that I can't really answer, and I frankly don't know much about it, is about whether India will allow dual citizenship to OCIs and PIOs in 25-26.
No.
I mean, it's a bit
unambiguous.
Don't think so.
All right. So I think wiser heads than mine have spoken on this. So we've already exceeded the time. So all that remains for me is to thank all the participants and all the panelists for providing us with an excellent perspective for the West. And I do hope that our participants who joined us, many of whom raised interesting questions, also benefited from this. Once again, let me thank CSDR and HBS for this opportunity. And so here is wishing you a good evening or a good night or a good afternoon, as the case may be. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining.
That
was a crucial discussion, I think. Again, I would like to thank everyone from behalf of CSDR. We will be back in July with the second of the HBS CSDR webinar series, where we seek to explore the China factor in the India-Europe relationship and address areas of convergence and divergence. I think it has come up very organically in this meeting. So it has set us up really well for the next in our series. So thank you again.